Would you be willing to walk across this bridge here in rural Texas? Originally, this was a footbridge. It was built in the late 1800s so people could get across the Biloxi River and get their children and themselves to church and to school. And then in the early 1900s, they decided to build a bigger bridge to get their wagons across. So they used whatever materials they had on hand. They used timber, they used cables, they used a lot of gas pipe because that was cheap and it was easy to transport and you could cut it to fit. So the structure became made out of gas pipe. But it doesn't look real sturdy today, does it? And before I'd be willing to walk across this bridge, I'd like to get some information first. I'd like to get some questions answered. I'd like to talk to some people who've actually successfully gone to the other side. I'd like to find out more about the history and how sturdy the building materials were. But even then, after we get that information, we still have to take a step of faith to get to the other side. Well, the same is true in the spiritual realm. Well, a bridge has been used as a metaphor for the Christian faith for a long time. The Bible says that our sin or our wrongdoing has separated us from God because He's perfect, He's pure, He's holy, and we're not. And so, according to the gospel, the only thing that can bridge that chasm is the cross of Christ. But before you walk across that, wouldn't you want some of your questions to be answered? Wouldn't you want some information? Wouldn't you want some of your doubts to be resolved? That's what we're going to talk about over these 6 sessions. We're going to discuss faith and doubt. We're going to look at 2 of the biggest objections to Christianity. And in the end, you can decide for yourself whether you want to take a step of faith to Jesus on the other side. I'm so glad you're going to be part of this experience. Enjoy your discussion together.
In 1980, I decided to investigate the historical evidence for Jesus. After 21 months of research, I came to the conclusion that Jesus is the unique Son of God and that Christianity is true. Nearly 20 years later, I began another investigation that really put my faith to the test. After I became a Christian in 1981, I realized pretty quickly that even though this was the most important decision I'd ever made, it was only the first step in a long spiritual journey. I mean, I was excited about my new faith, and I had this picture of it just growing progressively stronger and stronger. But I discovered that the Christian life isn't always a smooth road. In fact, at times it can be more like a minefield, loaded with many of the same objections and doubts that I had when I was a skeptic. And these doubts are inevitable. I mean, to some degree, we're all going to have them. The question is, how will they affect us when they hit? Are we drawn closer to God through the experience, or are we pushed away by uncertainty and confusion? Many years ago, I came across the story of a prominent Christian leader whose confrontation with doubt dramatically changed his life. His name was Charles Templeton.
On March 18, 1946, Charles Templeton, a pastor from Toronto, Canada, and his close friend, William Franklin Billy Graham, boarded a plane for London, England, and a historic series of Christian meetings. Decades later, Templeton reflected on their friendship and ministry together.
Billy and I met in the spring of 1945. It was backstage at a Youth for Christ rally in Chicago. The stadium was packed, and as Billy was being introduced to preach, he leaned over to me and he said, "Pray for me, Chuck, I'm scared to death." Well, that started a friendship that has lasted for over 50 years.
Templeton and Graham were soon preaching at Youth for Christ rallies throughout North America. Both shared a passion for the same message: personal salvation through Jesus Christ.
In the 1940s, Youth for Christ was a North American phenomenon. The atmosphere was informal and upbeat, and thousands of young people flocked to the meetings. The movement soon attracted worldwide attention, so a team was selected to take our message to Europe.
For 5 weeks, Templeton and Graham traveled throughout the United Kingdom, France, and Scandinavia. They shared the pulpit, preaching on alternate nights to large, enthusiastic crowds. When they returned home, many believed that Templeton would go on to become the most successful evangelist of his generation. Yet, despite the effectiveness of his ministry, he found himself facing what he described as a growing dilemma.
In the months following our return from Europe, I began to fight a losing battle with my faith. I'd been so busy that there was little time to take stock of my life. But in those occasional quiet moments, the doubts started to surface. You see, I had converted to Christianity as a teenager, and I lacked the theological training necessary to support my beliefs when those inevitable questions hit me. I wanted very much to believe. I had an intense longing for a relationship with God. But slowly, against my will, my mind and reason began to challenge and sometimes refute the things which were most important to me, the central beliefs of the Christian faith.
Templeton's doubts attacked the core of his deepest convictions, gradually eroding his belief in the validity of the Bible, the deity of Jesus, and the existence of a loving God.
My faith was disintegrating. I didn't have the theological training to deal with the questions that were troubling me. So, in a desperate attempt to find the answers, I decided to return to school.
In the fall of 1948, Templeton enrolled at Princeton Theological Seminary. After 3 years of study, he accepted a position with the National Council of Churches.
In the next few years, I moved across the United States and Canada, conducting 15-day preaching missions. Everywhere we went, we set record attendance. My days were filled with excitement, but I dreaded the nights. For at night, that was the time when the fears would set in. I would oftentimes break out into sweats, and my heart was pounding. I thought it was going to shake the bed. I had to ask myself, what right do I have to stand before thousands of people and try to convince them of something that I no longer believe? It was a reprehensible thing to do. So I had to stop. I had no possessions except a car and $600 in cash. And I would be cutting myself off from all of the wonderful friends that I had made in those years in the ministry. I felt like I was betraying all of them. But in the end, there was no real choice. So I packed everything that I owned into a rented trailer, and I started back on the road to Toronto.
Templeton remained in Canada for the rest of his life, working as a writer and news commentator. In 1996, he published his final book, Farewell to God: My Reasons for Rejecting the Christian Faith.
What happened to Charles Templeton? Why did he abandon the faith that had once been the cornerstone of his life? I was fascinated by his story, so in 1999 I called him at his home in Toronto. I remember that he answered the phone with his very rich, deliberate voice. I told him that I was a writer and I wanted to interview him about the reasons he had for rejecting God. And he said, well, I'm not doing very well physically, but yes, if you'd like to come up to Canada, I'd be glad to talk with you. So I was on my way the very next morning. When I met him at his apartment, he looked weak and frail. At first, I didn't think he'd have the strength to talk for more than a few minutes, but he insisted that I stay. He was very cordial, very kind, and I liked him immediately. I could sense that his mind was sharp, and he really wanted to tell me his story. He reminisced for a while about his years in the ministry and his friendship with Billy Graham. It was obvious to me that their relationship was still very important to him. And then, after a few minutes, he turned the conversation to his reasons for rejecting Christianity. He described several common objections, and he had a long list. But a couple of things really stood out. He looked me right in the eye and asked two rhetorical questions. In a world with thousands of religions and gods, why is Jesus the only way to salvation? Are we actually supposed to believe that only the Christians have it right? And then, with even more intensity, he asked, how could a loving God, the God of the Bible, create a world filled with evil and suffering? He wasn't looking for a response. He just wanted me to understand these issues that had troubled him for almost 50 years. We talked for another hour, and then I said goodbye. As I drove back to Chicago, I thought about his story all the way home. He was on his way to becoming one of the greatest evangelists of the 20th century, but his faith was destroyed by doubts that I'd struggle with myself. I wish I could have given him some satisfying answers. I really wanted to help him. And I also wanted to know that my own faith could stand up to the tough questions that had ruined his. You know, I think that's the moment I decided to launch another investigation. During the next 6 months, I traveled thousands of miles to interview scholars and theologians and ministry leaders who had confronted two of Templeton's major objections to Christianity. Why is Jesus the only way to God? And how can a loving God allow evil and suffering? When I left for my first interview, I remember feeling a little bit apprehensive. These were questions almost everyone faces at some point in life. And the answers aren't only difficult and controversial, they're also crucial to our perception of God.
For many people, faith isn't hard to find. Millions of Americans flock to churches every weekend. In fact, more Americans attend church every weekend than visit all sporting events combined. A lot of them come to mega churches like this one. This is Prestonwood Baptist Church outside of Dallas, Texas. Its building is so imposing, so massive that when it first opened, the local news media immediately dubbed it Fort God. Its campus sits on 150 acres. The auditorium seats 7,000 people. And a lot of folks find hope here. The Bible-based sermons give their life purpose, meaning, and direction. The various ministries of the church meet their physical and spiritual needs in a variety of ways. But does that mean they never have doubts? Of course not. But here's the thing. Many have discovered that their faith emerges stronger because of their doubts. And that's what we're going to talk about next time, having doubt in the midst of faith. I'll see you then.